It's a real pleasure to see David Nabarro here. David, I think, is familiar to some of you and will be familiar to all of us shortly. He is a physician and a public health physician by professional background and has worked everywhere. I think that's probably the best way to summarize it. After a career in medicine and public health, he was in the UK Department for International Development as Chief Population and Health Advisor and Director for Human Development. And in fact, I should be transparent on this, he was my boss there. And then he joined the World Health Organization initially to run the malaria program, and then subsequently he was the executive director of as executive director, he was in charge of the Department for Health Action in Crisis, dealing with all the stuff that you are familiar with, tsunamis and New Orleans and such like. So he brings a vast experience from both a public health setting as well as international systems, and as well as from his DFID background in particular in terms of how the international aid community works. Before actually his latest incarnation. His latest incarnation initially in 2005 was as the UN System Coordinator for Avian and Pandemic Flu. And as you know, we did not have a pandemic flu, therefore David solved that problem. And no wonder then that he was also then made coordinator of the UN systems and special representative for the food security crisis. And it's in that role, but also reflecting on his previous life. I hope, David, you will share your insights with us. What you have here in the audience are members of our staff and our Red Cross Red Crescent movement as a whole. There are people around everywhere. There are also some guests from outside, and those of you who are from outside the Red Cross Red Crescent, a warm welcome to the Federation. David.
Thank you. Mukesh Kapila, Excellencies, staff from the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement, ladies and gentlemen, it really is great to be here with you today and to have the chance to reflect on the aspects of my current work on food security. But I often find when I am invited to give a talk and when I'm introduced with an account of jobs I've done in the past, I feel I have to spend a few minutes explaining, in a way, this rather odd career trajectory that I've had. And I'm going to just do that as part of my introduction. I qualified as a medical doctor in the 1970s and fairly quickly found myself working in a number of different war zones and development settings with different non-governmental groups. And then after doing postgraduate training in public health, and then having a job as a teacher in London and in Liverpool in the UK, I then shifted gear and moved into government and became involved in development and the institutional and political dimensions of development more generally. And that shift in focus from being a practitioner, working with people who were often suffering from extraordinarily difficult and challenging circumstances, into working in policy and institutional aspects of development was for me a fantastic privilege, because I was able to take what I learned from communities who were experiencing the difficulty that is experienced every day by something like 5 billion people in our world. I was able to take that experience into organizations that were professionally established to try to make things better for them. And so really the last 15 years of my life has been entirely working in policy and institutional settings where I am consistently challenged by those with whom I worked at the beginning of my career to see whether or not we're able to make a difference. And my commitment, almost entirely in the different jobs that I've had, whether I was working on malaria or on emergencies or on pandemics or now on food and nutrition, my commitment has just been a very simple one, which is to try to make certain that the various different parts of our international, regional and national systems that seek to promote equitable development, that these systems actually work, and that they work well, and that they work efficiently, and that people in different organisations work together rather than working separately, that they don't just tackle the easy issues, but they take on the hard ones as well. But most importantly, that in doing this work, they empower individuals, societies, and nations so that they are better able to promote their own development and sustainability and well-being. So that has been my challenge, and it's with that in mind that I come into this room that I've been into on several occasions before with real joy, because for me, the Red Crescent movement is the ultimate social movement that seeks to empower people and their societies to have a better life. So thank you for the chance to be here and for that few minutes of explaining myself. For the next 20 minutes, I would like to talk about work that is now underway on food security and on scaling up nutrition. I would like to do it in a way that hopefully gives you some insights into some pretty complicated pieces of dialogue and action that are underway. I would really wish to stop by about past, and there's this great big green thing saying Rolex, which I think is a watch, and a tennis player ought to be holding it somewhere. But I'm looking to look at that green thing, and when that says past, if I've not stopped, then I hope a colleague will stop me, because I would like then to have some dialogue about these issues in whatever way you want. I'm accompanied by my colleague Florence Lasbens, who is the head of our coordination team on food security, and she is seconded to work with us from the French government. This is important because just at the moment, France is playing a critical role in the area of international action on food and nutrition security, and we will reflect that in the discussion. And lastly, I really am delighted. I just would like to acknowledge that sitting in our midst is the ambassador of Norway to the United Nations in Geneva. Bente, it's wonderful that you're here, and thank you for sparing the time to be with us today. In 2008, every day you opened your newspaper, you saw that food prices are rising rapidly. You saw that there were countries where people were rioting in the streets because they were worried about what is happening to their food. And if you read in the articles, you would see very clearly that this was proving to be a terrible situation for hundreds of millions of poor people. Because if you're poor and earning something in the region of $1.25 per day, you spend 75% of your income on food. And if the price of your basic foodstuffs increases by 30% over a period of 6 months, the impact on what happens in your household is devastating. We know it because we had just huge amounts of information coming in from civil society groups, from the World Food Programme, from governments themselves saying this is an impossible situation. Not only are we finding it difficult to go onto the open market to buy the rice that we need for our citizens, but also these very high prices are making it really difficult for our poor people to go about their daily lives. And our farmers, they would add, are also not finding it easy to cope with, because although on the surface it looks as though they've got a fantastic new opportunity to sell food at a much higher price, underneath it, they're very nervous because they're not sure that these high prices are going to stay, and they're worried that they might suddenly come down again. So all in all, in 2008, the food situation was very disturbing. And as you know, there were food riots in more than 35 countries, and in some countries they led to changes in government. So not only was it a problem of accentuated poverty, it was also a problem leading to greater political insecurity. But this was not an isolated problem due to failure of harvest in Australia or due to sudden increase in demand because of food going into biofuel production. This was telling us what we've known for a long time, but it was exposing it starkly. There is something fundamentally wrong with the world's food systems. Agriculture not working properly, food production, distribution and marketing not working as it should. And most importantly, somehow we were living in a world that produces plenty of food for everybody, but still 1/6 of the world's population was continuously hungry, and 1/3 of all children affected by chronic undernutrition. In a way, I feel that during the period leading up to 2008, we'd been anaesthetised to believe that this was just the way it had to be, that somehow there was no solution to this problem of massive inequity on access to food and massive unfairness of undernutrition. It was a bit like early in HIV, when there was an acceptance that somehow people in rich countries were going to be able to get AIDS treatment and people in poor countries would just have to survive without. But what happened as a result of these rapidly rising food prices was that there was an immediate and quite tangible shift in global attention to recognise that something has to be done about everything between how land is owned and farmed, how water is used in agriculture particularly, how farming systems operate, right through to what happens to food when it is processed and distributed, i.e. that food systems were in need of radical overhaul. Now, how is that process going? For the next 15 minutes, I would like to highlight for you some strands that I think are really quite optimistic about changes in what's happening on food security and nutrition, and then some areas which are still very disturbing. And I'd like to find out whether or not any of what I'm saying seems to be making sense to you, and in particular how we can individually and collectively work to support 3 key outcomes. Firstly, that everybody in the world enjoys food security, which means that they have the food that they need available, i.e. it's produced, accessible, i.e. they can get it, sustainable in terms of long-term supply lines, i.e. that it's going to be available over the course of their lifetime, and in a form that can be used, i.e. if they consume that food, that it will be turned into the nutrients that they need for healthy life. Those 4 words, availability, accessibility, stability or sustainability, and utilization, are the 4 dimensions of this word food security, which is such an important term for determining human beings' relations with their food and the sourcing of their food. The second political commitment above food security for all is an end to hunger. Now, we don't just mean hunger in terms of not having enough maize or wheat. I mean hunger in terms of having access to the full range of nutrients that individuals need for their lives to be satisfactory. And by that I mean under the age of 2, and such as when people have diseases like HIV or chronic diseases of other kinds, where they need adequate nutrition, otherwise the disease cannot be properly treated. So the second commitment, an end to hunger. The third commitment that I believe is important and that is attracting more and more attention is reduction in the actual levels of undernutrition, particularly what we call stunting, which is when people's heights or lengths are way less than what they ought to be, and not only is their physical height less, but their brain size is less, and their capacity, therefore, to perform intellectually as well as physically is reduced because of undernutrition in early life. So these are three areas of absolute need for action: food security for all, an end to hunger, and a reduction in undernutrition, to which there is increasing commitment by world leaders, building on the 2000 declaration that's on the poster announcing this session of the Millennium Development Goal, and really trying to get a difference. Now, what have we seen taking place in the world to try to move us towards those three goal areas as a result of the food price crisis in 2007-8 and the recognition that food systems are broken? Well, firstly, more attention to agriculture. But not just agriculture meaning let's grow more food. It's actually asking the question, what is the purpose of agriculture? And people in senior positions in ministries of agriculture, as well as in development organisations, are beginning to really understand that agriculture has the following key purposes. Firstly, it is a vital means of employment and prosperity for 500 million smallholder farming households in our world, who are the backbone of the world's agricultural systems, yet historically have tended to be neglected in national development strategies and in world development thinking, because for so long the purpose of agriculture was conceived of as producing the most food from the least land, or the most fish from the least water, or the most flesh from the least space in terms of livestock. And instead a recognition that agriculture is actually core livelihood for, as I say, 500 million smallholder farming families. So big shift one is looking at agriculture as a means of livelihood rather than agriculture as a means of producing. Number two, agriculture is also the source of nutrition for the majority of the world. So instead of seeing agriculture as primarily producing grains or pulses in large quantity, it's recognizing that through agriculture we can produce the mix of nutritious foods that are necessary for good well-being and nutrition of households. Per Pinstrup-Anderson, former head of the International Food Policy Research Institute and now at Cornell University, says the best indicator of whether or not communities are likely to have large amounts of nutrition is the availability of the necessary foods for a nutritious diet in local markets. And those of you who've been in northern Zambia, for example, will know that in 4 or 5 months of the year, each year, the market contains very little except for a few sacks of overpriced maize and maize meal, and that during those difficult months, getting access to the range of nutrients that are necessary through the diet in the market is virtually impossible. So agriculture is key for garnering the necessary produce for good nutrition. Thirdly, agriculture is vital to the sustainability of our planet. The farmers are the guardians of topsoil. Farmers are the guardians of carbon release. Farmers have access to the various instruments that we can use to sequester carbon. Farmers, if they choose, can practice agriculture that conserves nitrogen in the soil. Farmers are key to the future of climate change discussions, whether we're talking about COP17 in Durban at the end of this year or the Rio meeting next year. Agriculture is a vital part of climate change. It only came in to climate change discussions in a big way last year in Cancun. And so, therefore, I ask you, when you're thinking about agriculture, think of it in terms of livelihoods, think of it in terms of nutrition, think of it in terms of environmental sustainability, then you change your mindset about what investment in agriculture is about. You change the nature of your dialogue with the Minister of Agriculture, and the discussion between the Minister of Agriculture and the President changes as well. So step one has been a change in thinking about agriculture, a much greater recognition of the role of the small farmers. And one point that in a way it's point 4 in this series on agriculture, but it may be the most important, is that increasingly in the world, smallholder agriculture is women's business. Now, whether that is good or bad is not here to be debated. Sometimes it's unwillingly women's business, because what happens is the men do not want to be digging with the spade or hoeing. They wouldn't mind driving tractors, but they don't want to be doing manual agriculture, and they tend to go off and do other things, and the women have to stay behind and do the agriculture. So we do have to recognise that in attending to the issue of agriculture, we also have to recognise that this is primarily women's business. So during the last 3 years, within the United Nations family, we have tried to get a much better understanding about agriculture and its role, a much better understanding about the dimensions of food security, and then a much better understanding about the different elements of development policy and action, and also the elements of humanitarian action that will impact on food outcomes. To do that, we had to pull people together, and we had to make certain that focusing on agriculture and food security, we didn't just have the organisations that traditionally work on food, which are based in our case in Rome, but we also brought in the trade organisations, and they're based in Geneva, that we brought in the human rights organisations, also based in Geneva, where there's a rapporteur on the right to food who can help us, that we brought in the organisations concerned with nutrition and health, the World Health Organization, UNICEF, and so on, and that we created a much broader community of actors. And we had to engage also with the World Bank and the IMF, because they're key to the future of thinking about agriculture and food, and the OECD and other different entities. And we produced something that we called the Comprehensive Framework for Action, which was an attempt to try to provide a comprehensive analysis of the determinants of food insecurity and the options for making a change. Key in this is what we call the twin track approach, which links the need to respond to immediate needs in every society, not just in humanitarian emergencies, of people who are short of food. You must have safety nets and social protection mechanisms. There will always be people who are experiencing some degree of food insecurity. Safety nets are key to the future of food security alongside agricultural investments, and they must be supported. The Red Cross movement is probably the most important body in the world in helping to ensure that safety nets exist and in encouraging governments to make sure those safety nets respond to the rights, the interests and needs of the most vulnerable. The other part of the Comprehensive Framework for Action, which was key, was to stress the importance of bringing together work on environmental futures and climate change with work on agriculture. With this Comprehensive Framework for Action, bringing together different parts of the UN system, we were able then to work in a reasonably organised way alongside national governments, alongside intergovernmental bodies that were working on the whole challenge of mending food systems. This has been very strong within Africa, in the Comprehensive Africa Agriculture Development Programme, with national compacts and engagement of farmer organisations, civil society and the private sector in thinking about how to work together to respond to food insecurity. It's been less strong in other parts of the world in Asia, but it's been very active in Latin America, where particularly within the context of the Hunger Zero campaign in Brazil, we have seen a very good combination of social policy and national investment plans that has focused adequately on food security. Fine. So we've moved, we've got the comprehensive framework, we've got the UN working together. Have we got the political support to make a difference on food security? Well, it's starting. In Rome, in 2009, there was a world summit. There's quite a lot of summits in Rome, but this one was a bit better than usual. It led to the recreation of something called the Committee on Food Security, which has now become a new intergovernmental mechanism for negotiation and action, particularly on voluntary guidance on key areas of food security. Things like land grabbing, things like proper investment in infrastructure are all being handled within the context of this new Committee on Food Security. And this is different because it combines governments, civil society, private sector, United Nations organizations, development banks, research groups in one large international governance approach. Not perfect, still lots of questions being asked about whether it's adequately powerful. We don't have anything like this in health. We don't have anything like this in education. We have something like it in employment and labour, where you've got the tripartite governance. But in food, we've got a new effort to create what's called a global partnership with its own governance mechanism. If any of you are ever invited to be part of or involved in the Committee on Food Security, don't say, oh dear, another boring talk shop. Do try to be engaged, because this one is worth making to work. Secondly, we've managed to get the powerful nations, so-called the G8 and now the G20, to put food security higher up in their thinking and action. That, again, was not the case until recently. The G8 in Japan, and then in Italy, and then in Canada over the last 3 years, and now in France, putting more emphasis on this. But really exciting, the G20, who are working with a number of guests, I think, Florence, they're G24 or 25 at the moment, saying they're going to put food price volatility, vulnerability and food security at the centre of their agenda. And we are really hopeful that by the end of this year, we will see a much stronger political commitment to food security across the world. Lastly, if we've got political commitment, if we've got new thinking, new strategic directions, if we've got the United Nations working well together, fine, but are governments really committing to implement the kind of policies that will lead to food security for all, that will lead to an end of hunger, that will lead to a reduction in levels of undernutrition? Well, it's challenging. You know as well as I do that each government will determine its own social policies. Each government will determine the sort of common floor of entitlements that it believes its people should be able to access. They will be informed by human rights discussions across the way in the Human Rights Council, but these are essentially matters of political negotiation. And India has been struggling for the last year and a half with something called the Food Security Bill, which is a fundamental discussion about what is the level of food security to which each citizen should be entitled. But I'd like to tell you that it is my judgment that more and more countries are recognising that they need to have national standards for food security and, most importantly, national standards for nutrition. And one of the ways in which this is being manifest is through a new movement that has built up over the last 6 months called the Scaling Up Nutrition Movement. Very soft. It's not one of these things where there's a big global target and everybody is trying to buy into that global target. It's not a new world program run by any international agency. It's not a new fund which is going to put money into nutrition. In fact, it's the absolute reverse. It's simply an opening in which any government leader can say, I am committed to halving or reducing substantially, they don't have to be halving, the proportion of our people who are stunted, the proportion of our people who are hungry within the next 3, 5, 7 years. They don't have to do anything more than to make a commitment to act, to declare the results they're working for. And then they can come into this movement that has no owner, no international body running it. It is just there and available to anybody who wants to join. The original idea, when it was first mooted in September last year at the UN General Assembly, was that there might be 6 or 7 countries that would be prepared to come in, and then, without there being any offer of cash or any offer of any benefits, declare that they want to be part of this movement to scale up nutrition. Well, by February, there were 12 countries in. By April, there were another 6 countries wanting to come in, and we anticipate that before the end of this year, at least 25 countries will declare that they want to be part of the scale-up nutrition movement. But what it does for the rest of us working in the international community is really interesting. It challenges us to work together. UN, civil society, businesses, research groups, donors, development banks, foundations, to work together to actually show that we really are doing what we ought to be doing, which is responding to country-led plans and programs to improve nutritional outcomes and to reduce hunger. All modelled on experiences that have been successful. There's a lot of good news that's come, particularly out of Brazil, as I've mentioned, but also good news out of Vietnam, and growing progress in countries like Ethiopia. And what we are doing is seeing whether or not this movement is going to be able to make the kind of difference that I'm talking about. Ask us back in 2 years' time to report on progress. Let's see whether the combination of national political leadership, country-led plans, strategies that really are truly comprehensive in their structure, political commitments and processes, whether they're set up in Rome or in Addis Ababa or in Abuja, and an increasing involvement of multiple stakeholders working around these common objectives of food security for all, an end of hunger, and reduction in undernutrition. Ask me back in 2 years to reflect for you on what's happening, or better still, invite some of the leaders of the countries that have committed to scale up nutrition and to end food insecurity to tell you how they're getting on. Thanks very much for the chance to introduce this work.
My name is Laurie Werner. I want to thank you first for coming and really have a question that's a little bit of a political question. You said that the G8, the G8 has promised to make food security one of their top items. If this is so, many of the countries in the G8 are also countries that heavily subsidize their farmers. So how can you make food security one of your top items, but also subsidize your farmers and bring up the price of food and make it more difficult for competition for smaller farmers from other countries? Thank you.
So first of all, most of the leaders of the European, North American and North Pacific nations who are currently subsidizing their agriculture in this very inefficient way of virtually paying their farmers to produce and sell food more cheaply than it actually costs to do so, most of those countries want to end these subsidies. Ministers of finance don't like them. Ministers of Agriculture are embarrassed about them. The new Commissioner for Agriculture in the European Union would like to completely revise the Common Agriculture Policy. And if there is to be subsidy, he would like it to be subsidy for a particular kind of agriculture, like carbon capture agriculture. But in democracy, as everybody in this room knows, a president or prime minister can't just declare that she or he wants to do something and then do it. It requires a combination of negotiating with interests and also taking account of voters. I think we will see a mix of activities that will gradually reduce the levels of inefficient subsidy that is given to farmers in Europe and in North America. I think that we will also see a recognition, as we have indeed encountered from President Barroso in 2008, that one way of offsetting those subsidies is to increase development assistance for agriculture and food security. But I don't think it will happen quite as quickly as we would like, and it will be in some way part of the bargaining that goes on in the World Trade Organization's negotiations within the context of the Doha Accord. But just, it's one thing to find a policy's inconsistent. It's quite another thing for the government then to see an avenue to overturn that policy within the context of democratic processes and political survival that matters so much to modern leaders. And I think your point is a very genuine and important and potent point that we need to all the time bear in mind. And we must understand that leaders of poor countries kind of get quite outraged about two things. One is production subsidies, and the second is being shut out of markets so that they may be producing a product, but they can't export into a potentially lucrative market because of import bans. So very good point, and I think watch this space. I'm absolutely certain this is going to continue to be a really hot political issue.
We have a question from Javier Castellanos. He would like
in Panama.
He would like to know, what are the standards for food security and for nutrition? They are the common objectives that is looking for the initiative for government commitments.
The standards that are important. We are fortunate on nutrition that we have international standards that recently have been updated as a result of effort from the World Health Organization. And my own belief is that they are good international standards, particularly on growth and also on micronutrients, that everybody should be comfortable about using. With regard to standards on food security, it does get more difficult, but I like personally to start from the analysis of those who use the right to food as their basic starting point. And I don't know whether your colleague calling in from Panama is familiar, but there is definitely good language on the right to food. And there are some excellent guidelines on the realization of the right to food that are produced by FAO that are increasingly being utilized by governments, particularly in Central and Latin America, as the basis for policy. Thirdly, we are all the time working on, with colleagues in the international system, on standards for good food security policies, and I'd be very keen to share the new summary of the Comprehensive Framework for Action which we're just producing, which we believe provides a very excellent listing of some of the basic policies and practices that are appropriate for a national food security strategy. So we can follow that one up.
I was wondering, today there are so many crises, so to say. Our attention is challenged in so many ways. So how do you see that we can, stay focused on this? And I was wondering, if you think about loss to governments who do not give priority to this, the loss. What does it mean to have this stunting? What does it mean that you're losing, really, just the most important capital any country has, namely its people? Because here I think you could have a potential really to visualize this in a way that the treasurers would understand. So that is my first question. And you did not mention the WIPO, the patent organization, and how do you see innovation as a tool, new ways of producing nutrition that could be useful here? Thank you.
How to stay focused? Well, one of the things that I should have, I think, given more emphasis to is that it is probably wrong for us to in any way attempt to segment food security and nutrition from other key developmental concerns. And like many others, I'm recognizing that the poorest billion in our world, or the poor 2 to 3 billion in our world, are affected by multiple threats and shocks associated with ill health, particularly sudden illness, associated with lack of access to education, lack of access to justice, lack of protection against predatory behaviour by others, and of course, lack of security for food and for water. And I think that it would be unfair for me or anybody else to say, well, we should therefore focus on food and put less on health or less on education. I think the truth of life is that good social development practices must focus on the collective of miseries and hardships that are experienced by poor people. I do think that we need to focus increasingly on the rural poor, because I have a genuine view based on learning the work that I've been doing on food, that the rural poor have tended to have a bit of a worse deal than the urban poor in recent years. And that means also we have to focus on the rural space and the rural environment. So focus, yes, but I think that food doesn't really have any special place compared with the other areas. I think it has been neglected because people felt that cheap food was here to stay, and that's proving not to be the case. I think that for governments, the nutrition agenda is becoming more and more troublesome. President Banda, currently in an election process against other potential President Bandas in Zambia, is very concerned indeed about the very high level of stunting of the Zambian community. I know this because I've just been in Zambia with Florence. And what we see is that there is an increasing recognition of the cost to national development associated with having a population that is stunted physically and intellectually, and a population that, because of undernutrition in the early years of life, has a higher risk subsequently, not everybody knows this, of later life diabetes, later life cardiovascular disease, and other later life problems. So there's a big health, intellectual, physical, developmental advantage to paying attention to nutrition at a young age. And this has a massive economic cost and benefit that's been well worked out by our friends in the World Bank. So I am very keen to share with everybody here that the reality that this is relatively low cost in terms of repairing it and relatively massive in terms of impact, and worth discussing and debating with governments, with National Red Cross Society presidents and secretary generals and others, because it is significant in terms of long-term development. Innovation, ladies and gentlemen, this is something I didn't mention, but Benta's question helps me a lot. Innovation is key in all of development. There was an era when I was younger when people would say, we don't need new solutions, we just need to apply the existing solutions. And yes, there was truth in that. But the reality is, as all of us who own cell phones know, as all of us who have been involved in studying the potential innovations in pharmacology and in medicine, and particularly diagnostic and treatment know, that actually innovations can enable poor communities to leapfrog over some of the challenges and hardships that wealthier populations have had or so-called advanced countries have had. And some of these innovations in agriculture are potentially very exciting. Whether it is using hybridization technology to develop plant varieties that are not susceptible to saline water conditions, or that are less affected by drought, or developing irrigation technologies that use 1/10 or 1/20 of conventional water to get full production, or using better storage technologies to reduce the risk of aflatoxin infection into wet maize, or to improve the potential for preserving vegetables so it's easier for poor producers to get them to market. There is huge potential for innovation. I don't think we're talking about stuff that will necessarily be affected by intellectual property protection, but that's perhaps something I need to bring more into my thinking. It's more a case of making sure that the massive R&D that is going on in agriculture and in food systems is properly brought together and made available to poor communities in ways that they can use it. And there's a big role here for bringing together researchers, for using development assistance to link between technology and practitioners, and sometimes, very importantly, for private partners. There's a Norwegian fertilizer company called Yara, which is one of the most advanced companies of its kind in terms of understanding the potential importance of a production company that's producing inputs for agriculture, actually facilitating smallholder farmers to access that product, but not through shoving it and creating utterly unsustainable environmental conditions, but through doing it in a responsible and sustainable way. I'll sit down again for any more questions.
Thank you, David, first of all, for having brought a hopeful note in what seems to me a very bleak debate. I was responsible for the Horn of Africa operation in response to the food crisis in the Horn of Africa during exactly the period you were describing. So I might not necessarily fully share your optimism as to what is really happening in the field. I mean, to me, discussing the issue of nutrition in terms of food security is rather a clean debate, and it's rather a clean way of presenting that issue. I think it becomes far more difficult and far more sensitive when it's discussed in terms of abject hunger to individuals and to families. And what I missed in your presentation is one dimension, which is the political dimension of hunger. I mean, we all know there is lots of rhetorics. I mean, there's even been a World Summit years ago that declared the absence of hunger a fundamental right for all. But there again, we see how far we got with that fundamental right. To me, one of the problems is that hunger is a very difficult concept and badly understood in the West. And when we are thinking about being hungry at 5 o'clock in the evening before going home, which has a very different meaning than what it means in Africa, for example. To me, in the West, the concept of hunger has become hollow, and it has become a neutral, almost acceptable and normal concept. There has always been hunger in Africa, and there will always be hunger. That kind of thinking. But when we look at structurally affected countries, including in Africa, for example, the concept is very different. Also politically very different. It's a shameful concept. It's something that is hidden, that is not being discussed by governments because it might cost their survival. Okay, and that's one of the issues, I think, which was missing in this debate. I really appreciated the question asked by my colleague in Panama who was asking for standards, but he asked for standards on food security. I think it's time also to have a clear standard for what hunger means and ask governments to report on people who are hungry, but with a methodology that is internationally accepted and standardized. I mean, I was struck in Ethiopia to see that the number of people who were officially in need for assistance was halved just by changing definitions and changing the assessment methodology. As long as there is no clear, internationally agreed upon standard for what hunger means and forces government to report on that, I think we will have manipulation until the end of days. Then I also would like to underline that it's appreciable that there are new policies and new platforms and new fora, but I'm not so sure whether that is what is necessary today. I think there is so many fora and so many statements and so much commitment, but it is striking that while there was a massive crisis in Ethiopia, some governments who are well known for their protest against hunger were still massively importing teff to produce gluten-free spaghetti in their own country. Okay, so to me there is also a need to look at the political dimension and a need for a clear definition on what hunger means and do something about that.
Always educational to listen to you when you are talking, and really thank you for reflection and insight about what's happening in the United Nations. Big part of my intervention being covered by Roger, so I would leave out the political dimensions. I will ask maybe two brief questions. You mentioned in your talk there is two processes in terms of the global food security and nutrition. There is the high-level task force, which produced the comprehensive framework for action you showed. Then there is the whole job to reform the CFS, the Committee on Food Security, which is now working to produce a global framework for food security and nutrition. Okay. Now, my question, we are engaged with both. When you took up your job, I remember early 2009, we had 2 meetings to talk about the high-level task force, the comprehensive plan of actions. We have been part of that, and we are still supporting the comprehensive framework for action. And at the same time, we are part of the reform of the CFS. We also sit on that committee. We have a seat in Rome, and we are part of designing the new framework, global framework for food security and nutrition. Now the question is, how do you advise us in Red Cross Red Crescent? Where should we put our energy? Are these 2 frameworks going to merge? Are they going to be connected? Where is the positive energy? Is it where it stands? That's one question. My second question is,
very briefly,
very crucial to us about nutrition. We are trying to rebuild our nutrition capacity on the ground at National Society. We are putting some plans for that, but we wanted to see the connections, in terms of technical capacity support. What will be your advice on that?
I just wanted to say that, employment dimensions seem to be also missing from your presentation today. And ILO at the moment is actually developing a food security program which would address the issues of food security from a sectoral perspective and will support its constituents in developing, food security policies in the entire food value chain. At the same time, ILO, together with WFP and FAO, has been leading the work of UNDG on preparation of a guidance note on integrating food and nutrition security considerations into UNDAF, which should,
great.
Also help.
Thank you.
I'm Laura Garcia, counselor from the Mission of Spain. Thank you very much for your talk. I really appreciate it. I would just like to know your opinion on the on the latest issue of foreign policy. There was an article written by Lester Brown from Earth Policy Institute in which he argues that food is becoming the hidden driver of world politics in the sense that increased demand for food makes the ability to grow crops a new form of geopolitical leverage. This is explained by the food crisis in 2008. Countries traditionally exporting food at that time clamped down exports to keep domestic prices low, and importing countries leased land in more irrigable countries as a reaction to that in order to grow grain and produce biofuels. It has become a very huge political issue, and I would just like to know your opinion on that. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
In a way, this round of questions is intensely political. Good, good, good. I mean, everything that we're involved in our work actually is always running around the edge of big political debates, disputes, dialogue within countries, between countries. I mean, that is just the nature of our life, particularly somebody like me, a bureaucrat, very much operating within a political context. And it would be foolish and wrong for me to deny the existence of that political context. It would be foolish and wrong for me to in any way belittle it. But at the same time, I'm quite proudly stating that I am not going to be made impotent as a result of the political context in which we work. So yes, I absolutely will state back to you that there is a profound political dimension to hunger. There is an extraordinary capacity in some settings for governments to tolerate and even to sometimes stimulate hunger among sections of their populations for particular political reasons. There's also, as has been suggested, been an amazing capacity of global policymakers to somehow accept that it's okay that 1/6 of the world's population is chronically hungry. Chronically hungry. I know very few people who've experienced chronic hunger, but one of them is my boss, the Secretary General of the United Nations. It's not known by many people that when he was young, there were many, many days when his family only had one meal a day. He never talks about it. Doesn't even talk about it to his officials. He only mentioned it to me very much en passant once when we were talking about the story of South Korea. It is, when the more I hear people who have experienced this, it is unbelievably awful. And the dilemmas faced by women who have to work in their fields, look after their households, and at the same time seek to ensure adequate nutrition for an 18-month child who's got diarrhea, who they're carrying around on their back while they're working in the fields. They're not at all pleasant dilemmas, much tougher than anything I've had to do in my life. So I think there are intense political issues around hunger and malnutrition at every level, from the household through to the world. And so what should we do about it? Yes, it would be great to have better standards, but we tried to do that when judging health systems in 2000 when I was working in WHO with some really tough standards, and the reaction from governments in the end was to say, you may not do this. So there are some quite big difficulties within the international system, but there are many civil society organisations now, particularly those working on the right to food, who are doing just what you've described. The Right to Food Watch is an amazingly potent production by a group of human rights organisations who are organising around the right to food. And an increasing number of civil society organisations and NGOs are now working for food justice. Oxfam have just started a food justice campaign. And there's nothing to stop your humanitarian diplomacy group organising around food justice and working at the national level for food justice. Other groups, the Ecumenical Advocacy Alliance here in the World Council of Churches, they're going down that route. It's not an unreasonable direction to go in, even if you're a mainstream civil society organisation. And built into that, the Right to Food framework provides a very good accountability framework for addressing just the issues you've described. Going one step further, I'm delighted the Red Cross is working within our bureaucratic environment to help us with the comprehensive framework for action. But I really encourage you, Mohammed, to put as much energy as you can into the Committee on Food Security. Make it real. Make it work. Make it address these concerns. You are an organisation that ought to be there and visible. It'll be difficult. It's a huge investment of scarce time and energy. Because it's dealing with difficult issues, there's a lot of filibustering and conversation that goes on. But we're there, we're in there. We are offering the best of our intellectual and organisational, institutional capacity to this new organisation to try to help it address some of these justice issues around food security. And nothing would be better than having you and your team participating in. So there is big, big money in food. And so inevitably, a particular kind of political analysis will look at the way in which food and water is being accessed, is being accumulated, and then is being used as a basis for wealth and a basis for political decisions and action. We've been used to it for water, but now we're having to learn that that's relevant for food. Lastly, I'm deeply sorry. I should have said much more about the truth that is, I'm not just talking, when talking about smallholder agriculture, about the farmers and production. I'm talking about the often very poorly remunerated people who work with very little security in agriculture, either in production or in the value chain or in retailing. And I believe that the ILO approach to decent work that is looking at agricultural labour is important from a whole variety of points of view. These people are rarely unionised, they have very little protection. If they get injured, they get no kind of benefits, and they're often exposed to health hazards that we know, whether they're in livestock or in fish or in production of grain, from a variety of different things that are used. So I would just like to end by thanking ILO for all they're doing and saying how delighted we are that ILO is such a strong member of the high-level task force. I just forgot, I'm sorry. I mean, it was bad. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David.